Welcome to the Modern Athenas podcast with Sonia and Debbie, where we discuss how regular women became Athenas in their own time by working hard, persevering through the challenges in their lives, and contributing to a better world. This is podcast 9. In this podcast, we will be discussing the book Gertrude Bell, Queen of the Desert, Shaper of Nations, by Georgina Howell. You can use the link on our website at modernathenas.com to order the book after the podcast. We chose to talk about this book because Gertrude was a true modern Athena in the way she took on risk, stereotypes, and challenging situations. Her work brought new archaeological finds, destroyed stereotypes of what women could be, brought closure to families during World War I, and then ended up shaping the modern Middle East. There is no way that we can do justice to Gertrude's amazing work in our podcast today. The 450-page tome is not just a historically accurate portrayal of Gertrude's life, but it includes exquisite detail into each of her journeys, the people she met along the way, and the politics of each of the worlds she passed through. It also provides incredible detail on the history of the Middle East and why it looks the way it does today. I would urge any of our listeners who have any interest in learning about why the modern Middle East has so much conflict today to pick up this book and read it. Of note, the book uses historical names for places such as Persia, Mesopotamia, and Constantinople. As much as possible, we will use the modern names, though due to the quotes from the book, in many cases we will interchangeably be using the historical names for these areas.
We pick up Gertrude's story in 1868. She was born and grew up near Newcastle, in England, in a well-to-do family. Her mother passed only 3 weeks after the birth of her brother in 1871. From an young age, Gertrude developed a close relationship with her father that would continue throughout her life. Her father remarried to Florence Oliphant when Gertrude was 8. Gertrude had a good relationship with her stepmother, although they were never as close as Gertrude was with her father. In the 1870s and 1880s, girls did not train for any profession or go to school. Quote, Florence subscribed to the then common medical theory that girls become overstrained if subjected to too much mental exertion. For adolescent girls in particular, education was supposed to be a serious health risk. End quote. However, Florence decided Gertrude was a special case, who at 15 was so confident and thirsty for knowledge that Florence sent her off to Queen's College. Gertrude shined in the classroom and after graduation in 1886 enrolled in Lady Margaret Hall, one of the 2 women's colleges at Oxford. She took a first-class degree, which was, quote, the pinnacle of intellectual qualification. The first-class student must see beyond the accepted theories of the day, marshaling knowledge to explore new horizons of understanding, challenging the finest minds in the subject without faltering. Gertrude was the first woman to receive a first in modern history, end quote. Her best friend at university wrote, quote, she was, I think, the most brilliant creature who ever came amongst us, the most alive at every point, with her tireless energy, her splendid vitality, her unlimited capacity for work, for talk, for play, end quote. Her stepmother wrote, quote, in truth, the real basis of Gertrude's nature was her capacity for deep emotion. Great joys came into her life, and also great sorrows. How could it be otherwise with a temperament so avid of experience? Her ardent and magnetic personality drew the lives of others into hers as she passed along, end quote. So it appears that from an early age, Gertrude was not only remarkably intelligent, but getting opportunities that were completely unnatural for women of her time.
Yeah, and we'll see that throughout the podcast today, that she did things that generally women didn't do, and in doing so sort of broke a lot of glass ceilings and also moved history and progress forward. Gertrude always had to have a project that she was working on. Fond of family vacations to the Alps, she decided to take up mountaineering. From 1899 to 1904, Gertrude became one of the most prominent women climbers in the Alps. In 1899, she successfully summited her first 2 mountains both in France, Mesh, a 13,000-foot mountain, and Les Écrins at 13,422 feet. The following year, she decided to tackle Mont Blanc, which at 15,771 feet was the highest summit in the Alps. Although not the most difficult to climb, it was a serious proposition and physically demanding, and to date, more than 1,000 climbers had died trying to summit it. Quote, a well-known contemporary mountaineer was to confide in the Alpine Club that his most vivid recollection of his ascent of Mont Blanc was the effort required to follow Miss Bell. Her fame as a mountaineer was beginning to spread. End quote. She went on that season to climb 2 other peaks in the Mont Blanc range. In 1901, she met back up with her climbing team in the Bernese Oberland in Switzerland. Her first ambition was to climb the Schreckhorn. Quote, "It lifts its 2 streaming peaks against the sky like enormous waves just before they break. The high point on a long, narrow ridge of crags, it is one of the most ruggedest and difficult of all 13,000-foot peaks in the European Alps, primarily due to the 2,000-foot rock tower that forms its icebound summit." End quote. She successfully summited the mountain, beating her male climbing companions by 15 minutes. She then put her mind to becoming the first mountaineer to climb, systematically, the peaks of the Engelhorner range. One of them, Gertrude Spitze, or Gertrude's Peak, was later named after her. So early on, after she had already done great things in university, here she just decides to take on mountaineering as a new adventure.
And not just for the first time as a woman, but the first time for anybody. So she is now, it seems like she's beginning this life of trailblazing, which sets the tone for the rest of her story.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that at this time, 1899 to 1904, mountaineering at this time, much different than what it is today. They didn't have all the high-tech equipment. They didn't have, the means and the GPS and the maps. It was much more of this sort of rugged, rural, just sort of gutting it out method of climbing. And the book talked a little bit about how she had to make unique clothes just so she was able to climb the mountain, because in those days women didn't wear pants. And this past September, when I was in Chamonix, I was able to go to this Alpine museum and see the type of equipment that they were using to climb. And, a lot of it was wood-based and just this very sort of primitive methods. Next up for Gertrude was Finsteraarhorn, the highest mountain in the Oberland at 14,022 feet. The first descent had been made in 1812, but the northeast face of the mountain had never been climbed, and she and her climbing partner wanted to be the first to summit via the northeast face. Quote, "For the next 25 years, it would be regarded as one of the greatest expeditions in the history of alpine climbing." End quote. They attempted one route for 24 hours, but returned to the hut on the mountain in defeat. The next day, they tried 2 other routes, but still could not make it to the summit. They were only 50 feet from the summit of the ridge. It could not be conquered. Now her climbing team needed to find a way down. A storm had rolled in on the mountain, making the descent down even more dangerous. They could not make it down that night and were forced to spend the dark hours halfway down the mountain. They squeezed into a crack on the rock face, finding just enough room to wedge in and try and keep each other warm. Quote, "Always, in situations of extreme danger, Gertrude could somehow detach herself from her suffering and drive on. This extraordinary ability now allowed her to exercise the utmost courage. When things are as bad as they ever can be, you cease to mind them much. You set your teeth and battle with the fates. I know I never thought of the danger except once, and then quite calmly." End quote. The climbers again started moving at dawn. The ropes were stiff and slippery with ice from the storm, and the steep and narrow gullies were waterfalls. Suddenly, quote, "each of the climbers fell in the same place, one after another, spinning into the abyss, and then brought up with a rib-cracking jerk as the rope held." End quote. They continued on down the mountain. They endured another night in the open on the glacier, the weather still storming. The next day they staggered back into town, and the legend of their failed climb was born. Her fellow climbers noted, quote, "The honor belongs to Miss Bell. Had she not been full of courage and determination, we must have perished." End quote. So very early on in Gertrude's adulthood, we are seeing this ability for her to detach from the pain and the suffering and the moment to be able to keep persevering through a challenge.
And that must have been an unusual enough set of traits that she was then kind of put into this leadership position. And it was clear that her team looked to her for that leadership pretty instantaneously because she had those abilities.
Yeah, and I think that it was really interesting because, first of all, she's a woman climber, which was unique at that time. And on top of that, as you were mentioning, she had great leadership capabilities. So I wonder what her climbing partners were thinking and the amount of respect that they had for her for sort of overcoming both of those 2 stereotypes, because women in that time didn't usually give off a lot of leadership qualities. Gertrude's love of travel began early in her life. By her early 20s, she had already been to Bucharest and was bitten by the travel bug. When she was 24, her aunt invited her along to Persia, now modern-day Iran. Gertrude began to learn Persian before she left for her trip. By the time she arrived in Persia 6 months later, she was able to understand the language when it was spoken. She would later become fluent in the language. Quote, "In the East, Gertrude became her own person. Her spirits soared and her receptiveness to nature and life expanded so that she was forced to recognize within herself two Gertrudes. Part of the sense of difference was that here there were few rules, few exceptions. She had emerged from the shadow of the bells into the light of independence. It had the effect of humbling her, and led to her conclusions and realizations that would not have happened at home." End quote. After her Persia trip, Gertrude published a book entitled Persian Pictures, which was a travel book that made use of her diaries and letters home from Persia. It was published anonymously in 1894. It would be one of the first of many books that Gertrude would write. So again, she's starting to travel through sort of Eastern Europe and the Middle East. And I was sort of struck by the fact that here she's going to go to Persia and she's working hard to learn the language before she goes, which even a lot of modern day travelers don't do.
Well, it seems to show that she wanted to have an understanding and some sort of ability to communicate with the people there, and that I think that's another theme that we see with her. She knew what people needed and what the best way was to kind of genuinely communicate and connect with them.
In 1897, Gertrude went on an around-the-world trip with her brother. The trip returned via Egypt, Greece, and Constantinople. In 1899, Gertrude went to stay with family friends in Jerusalem and visited Damascus, Beirut, Athens, and Smyrna. Before learning Persian, Gertrude already spoke French and Italian. Through these trips, Gertrude learned Arabic, Turkish, and some Hebrew. From 1900 to 1905, Gertrude set off on numerous Middle East trips covering modern-day Turkey, Syria, Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. Quote, "Gertrude was an avid sightseer. No temple, museum, or ruin within reachable distance went unviewed by her. Nor did she stop working on her languages or reading." End quote. She was the first woman to ever travel alone in many of these territories. Quote, "Driven by her need to test herself, she veered towards challenges tinged with danger and excitement." End quote. Travel in those days was by horse or camel through the desert. Gertrude traveled with a hired group that was a mix of local and Arab men. Quote, "She learned the ABCs of desert travel as she went. She found the maps full of errors and often underestimating distances." End quote. Every day she learned something new about desert travel. The book goes into great detail of each of Gertrude's journeys, discussing how her party moved through the desert and survived the harsh climate. Gertrude's ability to speak the language and her sensitivity to local culture made her more welcome by the tribes in the Bedouin desert areas. She would travel with gifts for the sheikhs as peace offerings. In turn, they would provide a local guide to take her to the edge of their tribal area, where she would repeat her peace offering to the next sheikh. Using this method, she started to build a network of supporters throughout the desert. She became a known person in the region, and word of her travels began to spread. The contacts she made during these trips would come in handy later on when she returned to help shape the Middle East. Quote, "Gertrude was a new and modern phenomenon, a person who exercised influence by delivering first-hand knowledge and opinions based on that knowledge. At home and abroad, she conferred with the greatest men of her day. She was a gatherer and disseminator of information who lost nothing by doing the work without pay, gaining entry into the corridors of power. Entry as a full-fledged person." End quote. In 1913, Gertrude traveled to Damascus in order to organize a journey to Hale, a little-traveled desert oasis, before traveling on to Riyadh and Baghdad. She encountered many problems on the journey, including unfriendly Bedouins who almost made off with all of her supplies, but who were stopped by a tribesman within Gertrude's party who was on friendly terms with the Bedouins. When she got to Hale, she was held hostage for weeks, unable to continue her journey because her funds and her equipment were being held hostage by the governing tribe. Eventually, she was released and she left quickly, making her way to Baghdad. After she finished that trip, she headed back to England and arrived just in time for the beginning of World War I. So, as you were mentioning in the last section, her ability to speak the language started her ability to be able to grow a network here in the Middle East. And she worked very hard to grow that network by meeting with each tribe and respecting their traditions and respecting their culture.
So war was proclaimed on August 4th, 1914, and Gertrude joined the war effort by first working at a hospital in Surrey. Thereafter, she was asked to go to Boulogne, to the Wounded and Missing Office of the Red Cross. The Wounded and Missing Inquiry Department opened in Paris at the outbreak of the war, but it was unable to keep up with the information coming in from the front lines and the inquiries of families back home in the UK. Gertrude arrived and worked in the office with two other women that she knew. She immediately began to reorganize the office so that the information coming in was cataloged in a card index and in ledgers to make it more accessible and available as a reference for incoming inquiries. Gertrude also personalized the war notifications to families whenever possible. Quote, "I am glad," she said, "because the form in which we convey terrible tidings, that is mostly what we have to convey, matters very much, and when I have to do it, I know at least there are no pains that will be spared over it." End quote. In November and December being Gertrude's first month on the job, there were 1,838 inquiries from families, and her newly created card index listed 5,000 names. She was able to resolve the fate of 127 men. Quote, "The dead, the wounded, the missing, all of them, all of the mud and the blood to be reduced to names on lists on a desk in Boulogne." End quote. In one 6-week period, 4,000 lives were lost. The lists only got longer. By the end of the war, quote, "For hundreds of thousands of families, she had shown a light into the darkness and played some part in enabling them to get on with living. Her work for the W&MED was to be formally acknowledged as beyond value by HRH, the Princess Christian, and the other members of the War Executive Committee." End quote. She seemed to have this artful ability to interweave detachment and compassion at the same time, and this must have been just a heart-wrenching task that she had before her, but she was able to accomplish it.
Yeah, and these days, notifications of a deceased family member, soldier, Marine, airman, from a war is so sort of it's not manual anymore. It's just a procedure that's done, and it's so much easier. And notification gets home to the family often within 24 hours. And so the way that it works now obviously isn't the way that it worked back in World War I, when they didn't have computers and they didn't have satellite phones and they didn't have these methods to communicate and these expedited manners to get the wounded and the dead out of the theater of war. And I was really struck by Gertrude's ability to take in all of this information and make something of it, whereas before she had arrived, they were swimming in so much information that they weren't able to process it and get word home. And I was just thinking of all the families in World War I that in Britain that were waiting anxiously for any word of their sons and husbands and fathers. After the war, Gertrude was asked to go to Cairo by the British government because she had by now spent nearly 2 years of her life traveling in the Arabian deserts on 7 different expeditions and had observed the weaknesses of the Ottoman Empire, gathering significant information. On one of these previous expeditions, she had been asked by the Foreign Office to investigate how far German influence had penetrated the Turkish Empire in northern and eastern Arabia. She had reported back after her trip, much to the admiration of the Foreign Office. Quote, "Her ever-growing directory of contacts, her skill in direction finding and cartography, and the meticulous methodology of her records now brought her an official title." End quote. Gertrude became the first woman officer in the history of British military intelligence. Her first job in Cairo was to master the intricacies of Arab politics and personalities from the Hejaz, from Jerusalem as far south as Mecca, where it was hoped that a revolt against the Ottoman Empire might be initiated. The second part of her work centered around Mesopotamia, which had become of prime importance as the war commenced. Quote, "There was a crucial reason that Britain should fight the Turks in Mesopotamia: to secure the oil, which Britain had a large stake in, and its pipelines; to guard the threshold of India; to draw grain supplies from the valley of the Euphrates; and to prevent the Turks from using the Baghdad-Basra railway link to deliver troops and supplies to the theater of war." End quote. Quote, "Gertrude's grasp of the situation and her political acumen, her persuasive clarity in presenting issues of enormous complexity, were most valuable additions to the collective determination of the Bureau to find the way ahead." End quote. Gertrude also continued to encounter endless sexism and comments about her gender, usually made by men who were threatened by her brilliance. Once men got to know Gertrude, however, they generally accepted her as one of their own. So here we have her right after the war becoming the first woman officer in the history of British intelligence, and all of the information that she had started collecting on these expeditions that she had so judiciously wrote into these journals started to become helpful to the British as they were looking to unseat the Ottoman Empire from the Mesopotamia region.
And once again, as we've seen with some of the other stories we've shared on our podcast, when the stakes are high and the pressure is on, these kind of prejudices and kind of stereotypes kind of fall away, and excellence really needs to shine through. And she was excellent, and she was one of the best, and that's why they needed her.
History of Iraq leading up to the British occupation. Quote, Mesopotamia was not a country, but a province of a derelict empire. Iraq was not a nation. The very names caused confusion. Mesopotamia, which is Greek for between the rivers, was the historic and archaeological term used in the West for what the Arabs called Al-Iraq, or the Iraq. The Arab term originally referred to the area of the Basra Vilayet and Kuwait to the south, but when they took over, the British used it to describe the territory of the three vilayets, Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul. In 1932, at full independence, the country was finally officially recognized as Iraq. End quote. At the time, Mesopotamia was a land where there were perhaps more races, creeds, and allegiances than anywhere else in the world. The Turkish bureaucracy had imposed its dark empire over the length and breadth of Mesopotamia by a policy of division and dominance over the 50 tribes of Iraq. Under Turkish rule, the historic enmities between the majority Shia population and the Sunnis were deepened. Quote, it was hard for the tribes to believe that the new occupiers of Baghdad would hold on to their conquest, or that the Turks would not eventually return, ready to exact a horrible revenge on all who had placed their trust in the British. End quote. Gertrude in Baghdad. Gertrude arrived in Basra in 1916 and proceeded on to Baghdad in April of 1917. She became what might have been the most prominent British personality in the Middle East. Quote, perhaps no other Westerner understood as thoroughly as Gertrude how these people had emerged from their history. End quote. Gertrude completed her work of collecting tribal information for Mesopotamia and became the Oriental Secretary and Assistant Political Officer for the British Chief Political Officer in Basra, Sir Percy Cox. Quote, she saved him endless time by screening and entertaining his many shapely visitors from all over Mesopotamia. She filtered out the unimportant ones and sent the rest into Cox's office with a concise note stating the name of their tribe, where they came from, and what they wanted. End quote. She was the communications mastermind. In 1916, when the Sykes-Picot Agreement was signed, parceling up the Middle East between Britain, France, and Russia, it was Gertrude who held the tribal alliances together and who almost single-handedly was responsible for maintaining the Arab trust in the British in Iraq. In October of 1917, Gertrude was made a commander of the new order of the British Empire. Whatever road was taken to Iraqi nation-building, Gertrude was right in the thick of things. There was a significant lack of qualified British administrators in the region, and much of the intelligence and informational briefings fell to Gertrude. When a new administrator arrived in Iraq, he would be immediately transported to Gertrude's office. Quote, there he would remain for some hours while she explained the job as it would have to be done on the ground, in a territory where each district was quite distinct from its neighbors, ethnically, religiously, economically, and socially. Whatever the common policy, it had to be implemented sensitively and intelligently in ways that would suit the attitudes and skills or lack of them of the local people. She would explain the status quo, the problems of the specific community, and who was who. End quote. Gertrude was single-handedly holding the British administration in Iraq together. So here we have early on, as the British have been moving into Iraq and pushing the Ottoman Empire back north into Turkey, Gertrude has come in and using her ability to gather intelligence and her network of tribes that she's made over all of these expeditions that she's taken in the Middle East, she's become a prominent person and playing a very prominent role in Britain's ability to sort of push north.
And I was reminded a lot of Harriet Tubman and how when she was drawn into the war effort, it was because she had this irreplaceable kind of skill and knowledge. And it was clear that Gertrude had that same just ability to provide something that they weren't going to get from anywhere else.
Yeah, and like Harriet, Gertrude wasn't fazed by this notion that as a woman she wasn't supposed to be performing this work. She sort of put her head down and started grinding, and just as all men were doing. And so she she didn't seem intimidated by the fact that she was the only woman around in one of these roles. Toward Iraqi independence. Gertrude focused on giving people, quote, the opportunity of making a place for themselves, end quote. She very much believed in the idea of self-determination and would continue to believe in the idea through the creation of Iraq. She became someone that the Arabs trusted. She used overtures with the various tribes not just to win trust for the British administration, but for the sake of peace and prosperity, to improve relationships between the people. Quote, she was doing the most important work she had ever undertaken. By means of the blending of British administration with Arab self-determination and pride, good government was about to be established. Stability would go on very nearly unbroken until 1920. The oil would continue to flow, and a benevolent British interest would be maintained. The sensitivity to Middle Eastern minds and attitudes that Gertrude brought to the administration would enable her to achieve what nobody believed was possible. This was the great task that laid ahead of her in Baghdad. End quote. Gertrude became increasingly frustrated at what decisions that she viewed as protracted and ill-informed were made in Europe over the Middle East. She used all the relationships she had built over the years to keep the trust between the British and the moderate Arabs in the region. In 1919, Gertrude prepared a paper for the Paris Peace Conference on the future of Mesopotamia and attended the conference. In June, the First World War ended and the League of Nations was initiated. At the League of Nations, an announcement was made that Mesopotamia would be constituted an independent state under the guarantee of the League of Nations and would be subject to the British Mandate, by which Britain was obligated to govern Iraq until the country qualified for independence and for joining the League of Nations. Later that year, Gertrude returned to Baghdad and began writing the Review of the Civil Administration of Mesopotamia, which became her magnum opus. The document was presented to both houses of parliament, and Gertrude received a standing ovation, which was an exceptional accolade. Gertrude also became responsible for compiling annual reports on the state of Iraq for the League of Nations and initiated fortnightly reports to the Colonial Office on the progress of the administration in Iraq. The Naqib of Baghdad agreed to undertake the formation of the provisional government. He invited 18 men to form the Council of State. The provisional cabinet was to run the country while it prepared for the first general election. First, the council was to pacify the country. Quote, peace and stability for Iraq was her consistent aim, so that the life of ordinary people could prosper. End quote. Democracy meant accepting the express wish of the people without flinching. Gertrude wanted Faisal, an old friend and ally, to become the king of Mesopotamia. In 1921, Gertrude convinced Emir Faisal to come to Iraq to, hopefully, become its first leader. Gertrude's intuition was right. In July, she announced the result of the referendum, and Naqib declared Faisal king-elect on behalf of the Iraqi Council of State. Gertrude's Iraq was beginning to take shape. So Gertrude was really playing this intermediary role between the tribes of Mesopotamia and the British administration, and also in Europe, because all of the decisions about Mesopotamia weren't being made on the ground in Mesopotamia. They were being made in Britain and elsewhere in Western Europe.
And, reading that she had an old friend and an ally that she wanted to be king sounds very unusual, but in that context, it makes complete sense that she should identify someone, because she's kind of straddling these two worlds and kind of knows what needs to happen so that this new country can interact with the rest of the world that she knows.
Yeah, and I mean, it's really interesting because the Middle East today has a lot of the same problems and challenges that Gertrude found when they were trying to create this country of Iraq that never existed. So the tribes in the area didn't believe really in these artificial lines that Europe was trying to draw between the different areas. I mean, the fact that they were trying to shape Iraq into this country was very difficult. If you can imagine 50 different tribes that lived just within what were going to be these artificial borders of Iraq. And there's a lot of tribes that would cross over into different countries once they were formed by Western Europe. For instance, the Kurds in the north of Iraq were also in the area of Turkey. So they weren't just sort of south of the Iraqi border, they were also north of the Iraqi border. So, and you've got these tribes where their primary allegiances are to the tribe. It's not to this new nation state they're creating or to, this figurehead. It really is to their tribe. And you saw that early on in Gertrude's travels when she would move from tribe to tribe and she was sort of escorted through the tribal area. But that became a big problem here because when she was trying to make Iraq, she had to take all 50 tribes and get them to work together. And they also had the second layer of challenge, which was some of the tribes were Sunni Muslim and some of the tribes were Shia Muslim. And those are two very, very distinct groups. If you look at modern day Iraq, you have the same problems. You have tribes whose allegiances are to the tribe and not to the country of Iraq. And you also have significant challenge in getting the Shias and the Sunni Muslims to work together. After the work is done. Once her work in building Iraq began to end with the election of Faisal, Gertrude began to look for other meaningful work in the country. In 1922, Gertrude was named the Provisional Director of Antiquities. She first had to write antiquities laws and was zealous in exacting Iraq's rights to its own past. She then worked to ensure that Iraq's treasures were brought to and preserved in the National Museum. When the League of Nations Boundary Commission arrived in January 1925 to determine the border between Iraq and Turkey, Gertrude was the one who entertained and briefed the members. The agreement placed Mosul within the boundaries of Iraq and kept Britain's partnership with Iraq for 25 more years, though both nations hoped that Iraq would become an independent member of the League of Nations long before then. Iraq's Constituent Assembly was democratically elected, the Constitution was created and passed, and on July 16, 1926, Faisal was inaugurated for the first democratic government in Iraq. Iraq joined the League of Nations in 1932 as an independent state. Gertrude remained critical of the management and organization of the rest of the Middle East, and particularly about the decisions that were being made about what is now Israel, the Palestinian territories, and Syria. She described the ongoing disintegration of the Middle East as, quote, resembling the collapse of the Roman Empire, end quote. This is not far off from what the Middle East is in 2017. So again, we have Gertrude giving advice, which was based on all of her travels through the Middle East, where she's telling both the British administration and Western Europe that you can't simply divide these countries with these artificial borders and expect everybody to unite around and sort of rally around the flag of the new country. She tried to continue to explain how it was important to allow self-determination in the region and how it was also important to respect the tribal lines and histories of each of the tribes in the area. Gertrude also remained very critical, as we just talked about in this section, of Israel, the Palestinian territories, and Syria. And for our listeners who don't know a lot about the Middle East, this is a region and an area that still today has a lot of different issues. Part of the problem, as we talked about very early on in the Iraq section in this podcast, is that oil is a resource in the region that is held, against pretty much any kind of invasion or any sort of conflict. Everybody flees to sort of defend the oil. So you've got, for instance, in Saudi Arabia today, oil drives their economy. In Israel and the Palestinian territories and Syria, you've also got the problem of water. And you have to look, if you look at a modern day Middle East map, look at who has access to water, especially the Mediterranean Sea, or in Iraq's case, Basra down on the Gulf. And water becomes critical for a lot of different reasons. But if you don't have access to the water, in some way your economy is going to be limited. It was also interesting how Gertrude, after her work was sort of done being this intermediary and communication person between Britain and the tribes in Iraq and Western Europe, she found this new purpose in becoming the sort of director of antiquities and preserving the antiquities of Iraq. And she had done some of this earlier archaeological work when she was traveling through the different areas. She made sure that, in her cartography and her maps, that she was noting where these archaeological areas were, and she, did some archaeological digging and research. Gertrude's death and legacy, 1926. As all these changes took shape in Iraq, Gertrude continued her work at the museum, but started contemplating her existence, the smallness of her retirement income, and the loss of so many friends who had already left Iraq. On July 11, 1926, Gertrude laid down to sleep and had consumed a large number of sedatives. She never woke. Faisal held a military funeral for her in Iraq, and she was buried in a cemetery outside of Baghdad. Her stepmother wrote, quote, Gertrude's death brought an overwhelming manifestation of sorrow and sympathy from all parts of the earth, and we realized afresh that her name was known in every continent. Her story had crossed every sea. End quote. The tributes to Gertrude were far and wide, As her stepmother had predicted, there was an outpouring of love and gratitude for what she had accomplished. In the Iraq Museum, one of the rooms was dedicated to Gertrude Bell and was renamed the Gertrude Bell Room. A brass plaque was put up in the museum honoring her work. The Times of India wrote that while the British appreciated Gertrude as an author, a traveler, and an archaeologist, quote, they remained to the end ignorant of the astonishing position she had built for herself in Iraq, a position which made her responsible more than any other single individual for the shape and appearance of modern Iraq as it stands today. End quote. So Gertrude, at the end of her life, seemed to lose her purpose. For this whole period of her adulthood, she had been working so hard in the Middle East to give these countries the self-determination that they wanted, to have them become their own freestanding countries, to push the Ottoman Empire back up in north. And once all of that work was done, even though she was working at the museum, working on antiquities, it just really felt in the book as though she sort of lost her primary purpose.
Well, and because it seemed like she was so emotionally connected to the people and invested in their future and the vision for their next chapter in their lives, that speaks back to what we heard in the very beginning of her story, was this capacity for deep emotion. And I think that she was able to achieve so much because of that, but I also wonder if she also took on the burdens of all these other people, that in the end it was maybe too much for her to bear by herself when, like you said, this kind of purpose and meaningful work was over.
Yeah, and as I just read, the British administration was starting to leave Iraq. So as Iraq was becoming its own country and Faisal was standing up the government, the British role in Iraq continued to decrease. So a lot of the network that she had built inside of the British administration sort of disintegrated, and didn't take that much time. I mean, it was pretty quickly that everybody sort of left and went back to Britain, and Gertrude remained behind. And this notion that she had of bringing the tribes together, of communicating between the tribes, ended when this government started to be stood up and Faisal was there and in power, and almost as though they didn't need Gertrude anymore, and all of this work that she had done for her whole adulthood was really coming to an end.
Well, and she showcased her entire life, she was always a brilliant person, learning all these languages, and just had this irreplaceable ability that the networks and the support efforts that she was a part of needed her and her abilities. And it was really remarkable that she was able to kind of always utilize her skills, but always to the end to have this deep emotional connection with these people that she probably really loved and cared for. And I think that probably is part of her legacy. But what do you think is her greatest legacy that she's left behind?
I mean, I think it really is the shaping of Iraq, and the work that she did to get the tribes working together in the same direction, and to understand that in order to have self-determination, in order for that to work, they had to work together. And I was really thinking as I was reading this book about how desperately we need another Gertrude right now. I mean, her ability cannot be diminished. I mean, the very ability of her to bring both Western Europe and the governments of Western Europe to understand what was going on in the Middle East, and at the same time drawing these tribes together to work together, is work that there's no one person today that can do it. And so I was just thinking about how much we could use a Gertrude, especially with sort of what's going on in the Middle East today. And, you read over and over again in newspapers and online and you watch it on TV, this sort of disintegration of the modern day Middle East. But if you understand how troubling and difficult it was to create the Middle East, and you read Gertrude's story in this whole book, you start to realize why these countries seem to be disintegrating. It's because the loyalties lie in the tribes. And beyond the terrorism that's being caused by, Daesh and Hezbollah and Hamas and other terrorist organizations in the region, the loyalties of people remain with their tribe. So they're focused on doing the best that they can for their tribe, not focused on how can I do great work for the nation. And so we could really use someone like Gertrude to come in and start to unite these tribes back together and explain to them how in working together they can actually make a better whole than they can working apart. And on that note, that's all that we have for today. Thanks for listening and downloading and sharing this experience of Gertrude with us. You can also interact with us and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we announce episodes and share additional information about each podcast. If you have questions or comments about today's podcast, please submit them to us via our website at modernathenas.com or our Facebook page, also Modern Athenas, our Twitter account at Modern Athenas, and our Instagram at the Modern Athenas Podcast. We would also appreciate if you support our podcast by leaving us a review on iTunes or Stitcher and subscribing to the podcast. In our next podcast, Podcast 10, we'll be discussing the book Life in Motion, An Unlikely Ballerina by Misty Copeland. As we leave you today, we want to remind each of you to never forget that you, like the modern Athenas we have discussed on our podcasts, has the power and capacity to be a change maker in your own world. Work hard, dream big, and reach for the stars.